So the first question is just kind of a layout. Rory, why do you think you are the strongest candidate for mayor?
Thank you, Dan. I think I'm the strongest candidate for mayor because I served on the village board for 8 years. And because during that 8 years, I did a lot of the work and took a lot of the kinds of meetings that are generally reserved for mayors. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Because of my background in economic development, I had the chance to meet with several high-level governor's aides during the Clinton administration, and those meetings yielded results for Forestville. We brought home laptop computers for the fifth graders in the District 91 schools. We brought back road money for Harvard and Jackson after I met with the Secretary of Transportation in the state capitol. We brought back money for the Ruse Center. We brought back money for Roosevelt Road improvements. And also, Dan, I have strong ties to the village. I see a lot of familiar faces, so many people know that I raised 4 children in the village. I've been very active in the schools. I've been very active in the park district. I've coached soccer for a number of years. I've coached the children of many of the parents who are here today. People know me. I believe they trust me. I've always been accessible. And as mayor, I will continue to be accessible. I'll open the government. I'll continue to coach soccer. I'll continue to be visible in the schools. I have a 9-year-old attending District 91 now. And there are other reasons, but I'll just stop there.
And Chris?
First, thank you, Pilar, Sky, the library staff's been great. Jill, Dan, the review for putting this on. Nothing excites me more than seeing like a full house when it comes to local politics that often gets forgotten. Why I think I'm the strongest candidate, I think the decision's binary. I'll put my 4 years against my opponent's 8 years and what we did on the council, how active we were in the community, because I think being a mayor is part being active in the community and part leading the village. And again, a very easy binary decision in my eyes because of the 4 years that I spent on the council. I would just say the things that I accomplished as a minority commissioner who was oftentimes the lone vote of dissent and the voice of the people. It was tough, exciting, but very rewarding. And I think moving into the mayor's seat, like I came pretty close to last time, as a natural progression to be the citizens' voice at Village Hall.
All right, I have like 3 hours worth of questions, and I have a few that have been handed up to me already by people in the audience. So if you would like to have a question put to the candidates, we have index cards. We'd ask you to, here come more right now. We'd ask you to write down questions, and we will work in as many questions as we can from the audience as we go along. So if you're mayor, does your name go on the signs at the entrance to the town? Does your name go on an event?
At present, I believe it's precedent to put your name on the door to Village Hall, the gateway sign for Forest Park. Currently, Mayor Calderon's portrait is displayed. I don't know if that's by ordinance, Dan. I haven't really looked at it, to be honest with you.
So your name will go on the entry signs?
I don't know that it's a concern. It's not something that anyone has asked me during this campaign. I don't have strong feelings about it one way or the other.
Okay. Chris?
Not important to me at all.
So, no.
If it costs extra money that we don't need to spend, why spend it?
Okay. So let's talk about economic development in the community, which everyone, I think, would agree is a critical issue, as Forest Park has, like many in most towns, has revenue shortfalls. Has economic development worked very well we're coming through a pretty darn good economy. Has economic development been pushed forward in a aggressive, progressive way the last 8 years in Forest Park?
Unfortunately, no. Mayor Calderon's first 8 years, I think that we saw a lot of development in town, and things slowed down. I mean, the reason I ran 4 years ago is I felt like things were slowing down. I know my opponent said he didn't feel like things were slowing down, but I really thought that the village was at a point where they're starting to get a little stagnant. And to me, a lot of that has to do with energy. If you're the mayor for 16 years at that point, you get a little complacent. And then you need someone to come in and kind of have that energy that you do in your first couple of terms. If you can't get the stuff you want to get done in 8 years, 10 years max after you get rolling, to me, you shouldn't be serving much longer. I'm kind of a fan of term limits. You can term limit yourself out, but you have that energy to come in and do the things right away. I think that kind of just a natural tendency that you become a little bit complacent after that.
So what does that energy look like around economic development?
Well, to me, it's an all-in approach. Recently, the Chamber reformed their Economic Development Committee. I'm not sure if everyone was aware. We had one for about the last 4 years. It kind of petered out. It was run by the mayor, and it didn't meet as often as it should. There was no set meeting times. They would be called sporadically. And then eventually, I think the last time that one met was like last March. So then the Chamber took it over and kind of, they're the ones that are running it now, and it's not coming from Village Hall. And I've said this before, and I know that some people in the Chamber aren't happy with me saying it, but I think it needs to be a partnership with the village. I think it needs to be a partnership with the bank. I think you need to help people develop small business plans that want to move into some of these storefronts on Madison. Right now, that's not part of the plan. That's me personally saying that as a mayor, I want to be all in. I'm going to be working with them and any help I can give. I think the mayor of Berwyn, like him or not, or like some of the things that happen in Berwyn, I don't particularly care for some of the things that have happened in Berwyn as far as far too many gaming, little mini casinos, if you will. But he's an aggressive pursuer of business for his town, and you have to give him that. He walks down Madison Street and talks to our business owners and gets them either to move or to try and open another spot in Berwyn. That's being an all-in type mayor, and I think that's what it takes to kind of give a little energy back to Forest Park.
So were we last 8 years first effective, ineffective in the last 8 years?
So as you stated earlier, we've gone through some turbulent times. Forest Park continues to have lots of attributes that I believe will appeal to businesses. As mayor, I will be a cheerleader for Forest Park. Dan, you've known me long enough to know that economic development is a part of my background. I spent 6 years with the Illinois Department of Commerce. I spent 3 years working in private sector economic development. I have contacts throughout the state with economic development professionals and beyond Illinois borders. So as mayor, I will reach out to all of these contacts to let them know about Forest Park, its attributes. I will support the Chamber of Commerce. I've talked with the president and the executive director of the Chamber. I'm aware of some of their future goals. I'm aware that they're part of a new regional marketing partnership. And I've pledged that if I'm mayor, they'll have consistent support from the village in terms of funding so that they don't have any concerns about their place with the village. I don't know that we need to micromanage their efforts, but I think that there are things that we as a village can do to supplement their efforts. And I'll share more details about that later.
So what's your concern with, let's start with Madison Street, where there are more vacancies than there have been in a while. The review has reported 2 or 3 fairly well-known restaurants are up for sale. Restaurant business, bar business, always a hard business. Where does Madison Street go, and what, as mayor, do you specifically do to try to bring some new life to Madison?
So as mayor, like I said, I'll be a cheerleader for Forest Park, and that includes Madison Street. I will work with my contacts in the business community, whether it's in Chicago or other parts of the state, to bring consumers to Madison Street and to Forest Park. I've talked to some about possibly developing the Altenheim project, and I'm sure we'll talk about that quite a bit this afternoon. But I see potential development of the Altenheim as a source of stimulus for Madison Street. Let's say there's construction. Where do those construction workers eat during the day? Do they eat on Madison Street, Do they all bring their lunches? Do they go somewhere else? If we have new residents coming into town, does that expand our economic base? Does that benefit Madison Street and the rest of Forest Park? I believe it does. And so there are lots of things to do to support Madison Street. A robust marketing campaign that highlights the attributes of Forest Park, its location, its population, and our tradition of festivals that bring people to Madison Street. I think all of those things will attract businesses to Madison Street.
Were you on here? Did people hear you the last second?
Yeah.
I don't know where it cut off. Now I know
Go
where
back
it
to
cut
the
off.
beginning. So
Just to sum it up, I believe Forest Park has lots of attributes. If we develop Altenheim, even partially, right, 11 acres. Yeah, I've seen Facebook commentary now saying no more condos. Yeah, I've never suggested that we build all of the Altenheim. A minimum of 3 acres has to remain green space. I'd suggest we leave, 4 to 5 acres green space, maybe more. But we could have some development. And again, if there's construction there, that construction has economic inputs that benefit the rest of Forest Park. Where do the construction workers eat? Is there participation for local businesses in the construction? I believe there is. Does it benefit Madison Street only? Probably not. But it does create traffic for Madison Street, and it creates consumers who will probably spend money in Forest Park. I'm quite certain they'll spend money in Forest Park.
So Chris, Madison Street, same question. Retail is obviously struggling. It is really hard to find retailers in the world, small retailers, restaurants suffering. The great resurgence of Madison Street now 20 years ago, which relied on those independent retailers and the restaurants arriving, not likely to simply be repeated. So what happens to Madison?
Well, I think the reviews pointed out as well, when you see no one, I don't think with a old school business mind would fund something like the Urban Pioneer Group. Someone would come with that business plan and you go, what do you want to do? But it's extremely successful, is it not? It's a bagel shop on Saturday, it's an event space. You have to reimagine these spaces. It's not going to be, the days of the saloons are gone. You can't be just getting a liquor license and printing money like you were in the late 90s, early 2000s. And to me, I've talked about it before, what would give life to Madison Street, if we're going to go and start talking about the Altenheim property again, my plan, and we've done some initial outreach, is selling off the front portion, which is typically called the Grove, where Ribfest would be, keeping the back portion as green space. I think green space is very, very important for our town. We're at a per capita level of green space, which is not even considered, we're not supposed to even be happy because we don't have enough green space. And with that front portion, I've talked about a boutique hotel. I think that's a winner for Madison Street as well. The Carlton is booked, the only area higher end hotel is booked at a over 85% clip on a consistent basis. So if we had a larger event space, conference space, and a boutique hotel, 80 room max hotel could fit into that space. There's a footprint similar to that space. There's a hotel not too far out in the western suburbs, so it can be done. And now you have people that need to drink, eat, shop right down the street.
Roosevelt Road, just been rehabbed, freshened up. The mall, Forest Park Mall, owned by Living Word, seems to be a problematic space. Hobo came and went in less than a year. The grocery store may not be setting the world on fire. It is a funky space with a long history in terms of the torpedo factory and not easily repurposed. What do you think is going to happen there? And what should, as mayor, what should the relationship be with the pastor and the church?
Well, the pastor and the church and his daughter Melody, who manages the property, I mean, they have a lot of control of what happens there. I know Melody. We just had lunch not but a week ago and talked about Hobo and specifically, but with the space as well, the one thing I was urging her to do, which a lot of the problems when they control The space completely is the outlets where the Portillo's and Taco Bell are. There's 2 more outlet spaces that they've never done anything with, as North Riverside gets, like chain restaurants is something that would work on Roosevelt that doesn't work on Madison. And North Riverside has every chain restaurant in the book. We have none. There's barely been talks there, and they have a very unique way of doing things where they don't sell the land to someone. They want to maintain everything and control of everything, which is their right to do. They own it, and then they lease out the land to whoever's going to move in there. Portillo's doesn't own their land, so it's hard to get people to kind of come to the table with that. But Melody's a ball of energy. Dan, she wants to do things there, and big box stores are dead. They're not. No one's going to start a big box store that's going to come in and fill Hobo for sure. And at last talk with Melody, she said there's a possibility of a banquet hall going in there, which would be an interesting use of the space. I talked to her about Family Entertainment Center along the lines of a safari land, and she was all in on that. We did some initial outreach on that. It's very, very, very early stages, but that's what's happening in those spaces now. Things like 115 Bourbon Street on the south side, where it's an adult entertainment kind of center. There's a lot of things you can do. You just can't. Okay, we need to get the Hobos aren't coming. Obviously, Kmart's aren't coming back. Sears. So you have to start reimagining those spaces.
We have a request to speak up a little bit. So,
I've also met with Melody Winston, and I understand some of the concerns at the mall. And I've heard her say that they don't want to sell the outlets. Her father wants to lease, and that's their private property, so I get their rights. But there's a bigger Roosevelt Road than simply the Forest Park Mall. I think there's the potential for additional residential development on Long Roosevelt Road.
what sort of residential do you envision?
Possibly condos. There may be an entity that wants to come by and acquire some small parcels for future use. I believe that part of the reason why we expanded the TIFs is that we were anticipating future development along Roosevelt Road. When I ran for commissioner the first time in 2007, I talked quite a bit about reinvigorating Roosevelt Road, revitalizing Roosevelt Road. So we beautified it, and that was a slow process. I believe it was my first term when I sat down with Phil McKenna. He's our TIF consultant from Kane McKenna. And we talked about the need to expand the TIF in anticipation of eventual development. Not long ago, I met with a couple of business leaders, and they told me that a property owner has an interest in building higher. I've heard from a number of people in Forest Park, business owners, stakeholders in the business community, who would like to see some more dense development along routes where there's close to transportation. Right, so I'd like to see us aggressively pursue the corner of Des Plaines and Roosevelt where the empty car dealership is. I'm not saying it's going to be another car dealership, but I believe it should be something. I don't think the village has been aggressive as it could be for that location specifically. But basically, Dan, I believe we should support development efforts in Forest Park to expand our economic base, particularly along Roosevelt Road.
So I work for a newspaper in Oak Park, and density and height are a big issue. So when you say more height, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about, so it's not my decision certainly, but what is a good fit for the community, whether it's 4 stories.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Whether it's 4 stories or whether it's 6 stories, I don't know the answer to that. But we have a plan commission, and we have expert planners who help us arrive at those decisions. Obviously, as a council and the mayor, we set policy, we approve their recommendations. But what I'm hearing these days from stakeholders is that they believe we should actually be building up and developing Roosevelt, that corridor.
So you're talking 6 stories, you're not talking 20 stories?
Certainly not 20.
Okay. So economic development is a way to bring revenue in, harder than maybe it used to be. What about the flip side in terms of costs? The current village administration would say, and has said for a long time, and I think with some virtue, that they have taken a hard look at all of the expenses, that it is a very lean operation, that there are not a lot of places left to cut. on the other hand, they've got eyes that have been looking at the budget for 20 years. So is there room to reduce expenses in Forest Park government? And specifically, where do you think those might be?
I believe there is room to reduce costs. I believe that we can competitively bid some of the existing service contracts,
Like which ones?
like ambulance services, auditing. I don't know which other ones. I mean, there could be insurance brokerage. There could be a lot of vendors who sell to the smaller departments, Dan, but there's got to be room. But as someone who's been outside the village for 4 years, I haven't looked at all the details. I mean, I've looked at the budget, and I see our numbers, but I have heard from department heads that they would like to see competitive bidding of some of the existing service contracts.
Chris, cost cutting?
I think there's room. Kind of went through the budget with a fine-tooth comb. Kind of feel like I never left the council after 2015, quite honestly. I pretty much stayed in tune with what's going on. And if you want to look at certain areas, we have some vendors that, for a town our size, they bill at a much higher rate than a town, similar to us. And there's multiple reasons why that happens. Sometimes staff has to lean on them a little too much, I guess is the nicest way to put it, if that makes sense. But I know engineering, law, we get, our bills are higher than River Forest is about the same size as us, definitely higher than them.
These are vendors who've been with the village for a long, long while.
Yeah. When staff has to pick up the phone for every legal question, and instead of talking to a paralegal, you're talking to, say, our contact lawyer, or you're talking to our liaison at the engineering firm instead of a lower staff, you're spending a lot of money right out of the gate. I think that's the reason why our billing is, on some of them, 3 times higher than other villages our size. So I definitely see room to cut. I'm not even saying that we have to get rid of the current vendors, but we can reimagine in the way we use them, I think is a better way to put it.
Staffing levels? Most money goes into staffing.
Correct. Well, I think you need to keep police and fire at the current levels for sure. The last thing you want to see is service cut in those areas. Our public works gets the most out of with what we have right now. And it's a fairly lean operation. I don't see staffing cuts being something that I would be considering right out of the gate.
Rory, is there room on the staffing front to reduce costs?
I don't see that there is now. I don't see there's need to cut staff right now. I think we have a great staff. I believe we can better train and better utilize some of our existing staff to implement other parts of my agenda. For example, in terms of sharing information, right? I see us having a robust website that lets people get information a lot quicker and is a lot easier to use. I'd like to see some of the existing staff trained to kind of service those needs so that the public has access to the information that it wants. In terms of where we cut or don't cut, on the legal side of things, I am an attorney. I'm not running to be the micromanager. But I believe I can definitely work with staff so that we don't have to refer so many questions to our legal counsel, our outside legal counsel. They do bill us very regularly, and we have a long relationship with them. I believe that's a contract that we can go back and look at what they bill and maybe reduce the hourly rates. And I think the same applies to our engineering contract and some of the other service contracts.
So one of the kind of sacred cows in Forest Park is the fact that the village plows sidewalks after snow. And there has actually been on social media recently someone saying, maybe we shouldn't do that. Is that like a third rail sort of a issue in Forest Park? And is that a relevant amount of money? It is certainly a point of boasting.
So let me say this. I take pride in the fact that every day every time we have a big snowfall, I'm out on front of my house by about 5:30 or 6 a.m. My wife wakes up at 4 to go running. So I clear my snow. When the Bobcat comes along, I can no longer see my sidewalk. I take pride in seeing my sidewalk after I shovel. So it's a personal peeve to me, but I also understand that there are senior citizens who cannot clear their own sidewalks. And so, I don't have the answer to that question today. Maybe we could better salt the sidewalks. Maybe there's something the community can do. But we have great snow removal, and I don't want to see that changed. I mean, it's great that our streets are clear. That's part of why we have the parking ban. Right? If it's late at night, they can come by and plow the snows, and there's no cars that are preventing them from clearing the streets completely. So I don't have the answer to the sidewalk question, but it does bother me that the good work that I do to see my sidewalk, it's all.
Chris, sidewalks?
I have a feeling if you took away plowing sidewalks, you'd be a one-term mayor. One thing we did do, I continued, actually, the commissioner that sat in my seat before me was Marty Talalian, and what he did was just reconfigure it so it was the last thing done. We weren't doing it on overtime, and I think I'm one of the only people, because, I worked very tightly with Public Works, that I notice when it snows. When it's snowing on a weekend at 3 in the morning, I know it's costing the village a lot more than if it snowed at 10 a.m. on a Monday. And that goes through my head every time I see it. So what Commissioner Talalian did at the time was say, well, we're not going to do, the last thing we're going to do are the sidewalks, and we want to do those on regular time. I don't think it wasn't causing people not to be able to get to work and walk to the CTA and whatnot. I think it worked out. It saved a couple bucks. Was it a huge saver? No, but it's a common sense solution. But no, I'm not going to take away plowing sidewalks.
Okay, so that segues into the commissioner form of government question. And why on earth is Marty Talalian telling the Public Works Department what order they should be plowing things? And if you're mayor and you have a commissioner of Public Works who is telling the Public Works Director, I want you to plow odd, even sides of the street on Thursdays, is that fine with you? Or is that like, why do we have a Public Works Director?
No, well, it's not like it's not like it used to be. There were commissioners that literally were down at the Public Works on a daily basis, micromanaging. When Marty made that decision, it was a council decision. He brought it up. He just didn't go to Director Doss and tell him, this is how you're going to do it. There was a discussion, and I don't, at least in my years on the council, I didn't see any commissioner micromanaging their departments. You're kind of consulting with you're definitely meeting about the budget. Your department's budget, you go over with the heads of the department, and you work through that, those kind of things. But I was never down at Public Works on a daily basis, telling when the trucks were going to go out.
And so what message would you send to commissioners elected with you in terms of what their role is versus the administrator's role?
When I got elected, I had a meeting with a higher ranking person at Village Hall, and they told me, well, you can do as little as you want or as much as you want. And that kind of frightened me. It's like, well, wouldn't you want the commissioners to be completely engaged and kind of be excited about coming in? And so I went with the route of doing as much as I could within my role. It wasn't what I would say overstepping your bounds, and working within what you're right. It's a weird form of government. There's not a lot in. It's a rural form of government where you have people that are actually running the departments, but we don't have that. I would tell the commissioners to not overstep your bounds, but be very involved in your department. I felt like I had a great relationship with Director Doss, and I never was telling him what to do on a daily basis, but we worked through the budget. He would give me a heads up on something, I'd get a call or a text from him, FYI, because Roy would say the same thing. When we're commissioners, people call and email us when there's a problem. they call the mayor a lot more, but if they know you're in charge of something, you'll get a call on that. And so you'd get the head up from the director, and they'd keep you informed, but you're not in there on a daily basis. I would tell the commissioners that, but make the most of your position.
Rory, Commissioner Form.
So, I've really thought about that a lot in the last few weeks, and I think I'm evolving every day on that question. Someone put it to me recently. They said, why should the mayor directly be in charge of the police chief, right? I don't know that there's a good answer for that. I've said it to several people that I see the role of the mayor and the council as setting policy, finding resources for the village, networking, and again, making decisions from a 10,000-foot level, as opposed to getting on the proverbial dance floor and trying to micromanage the day-to-day activities of the village. As mayor, I will meet with state leaders and federal leaders and county leaders to try to bring grants and other resources to the village. Tim Gillen, our village administrator, has delegated authority. Delegated authority is a little bit different than actual authority. And I believe it's problematic that he simply has delegated authority.
It's delegated because it's a commissioner form as opposed to a village manager form, where
Correct.
you would have legal...
Correct. And so I think we really need to look at our structure of government. And I've just seen it in this whole election cycle. You have village employees who are worried about their positions. They're worried about what a new mayor will do, who he'll like, will he reduce, will he fire, whatever. And I think that's a problem. So I think our village really needs to look at whether the current form of government is the best fit for our needs today.
And the message you will send to commissioners who are sworn in with you is what?
I will say get training in government. Get training in how to be a good local official. When I was a new commissioner, Mayor Calderon wisely suggested that I participate in a program called the IGPA, Institute for Government and Public Affairs. We went to about 6 or 8 training sessions, weekend training sessions, where we learned about governance, we learned about communicating with staff and with constituents, we learned about budgeting, we learned about a whole range of issues that face commissioners. We learned about other organizations that can support our work, the IML, Illinois Municipal League, and other groups, Illinois County Managers Association. I would want to see commissioners actively being trained to be more effective representatives of Forest Park, to be more effective board members, and to be more effective at bringing back resources to the village. I'd like to see our commissioners networking with our state leaders, whether it's our state rep, our senator, our congressman, our U.S. senator, at least becoming familiar with these individuals' staffs so that they can more effectively communicate on behalf of Forest Park and bring resources to the village. That's where I think the role of the mayor and commissioners is. Not to micromanage and not to decide staffing levels. Just like Chris said earlier, when it snows, I can't help but think about the overtime costs. But that kind of goes without saying. But yeah, we really need to look at our form of government, and we need to empower our employees to do their jobs without political influence.
So based on the fact that you have each run for the state legislature as Democrats, I am assuming you are both Democrats, registered as such?
I've only voted as a Democrat. I've never pulled another ballot.
And you're a registered Democrat?
You get the voter data when you're in an election, and it reads out what everybody is. Actually, it guesses your race and everything else, but it calls me a hard Democrat, a hard D. So yeah, I have pulled the Republican ballot to vote for Judy Bartopinka to win against, I believe it was Oberweis, to beat Rod Blagojevich, because I did not care for Rod Blagojevich.
So this is a question I'm kind of uncomfortable, because my history is not paying attention as to whether someone's a Democrat or Republican when they're running for a local office, but here we are. So on a spectrum of centrist to progressive Democrat, in terms of a national perspective, where are you?
Do you want to go through item by item, or
Just give me your general sense.
Well, even on my time on the council, sometimes jokingly, I guess I was called the green candidate because I think it's a progressive stance to try and institute green solutions wherever and whenever we can, to the point where probably other members of the council were annoyed that I would try to, make motions to amend contracts we had to include green solutions. I would call that a progressive stance. What else do you want to go through?
So in general, you would think your politics, you're left of center, you're basically centrist?
I think where I stop is tell me how we're going to pay for it first. So I don't have a problem with social programs. How are we going to pay for it? And as long as we're paying for it, I'm happy with it. If we can find the money to pay for other things, I'm happy for it. And I think sometimes you get pushed off the progressive podium when you say, well, we've got to pay for this. Now let's have a conversation about how we pay for it. So,
Okay.
Yes, if we could pay for it.
Yep. Rory?
At one point, I was president of the Proviso Township Democratic Organization. I believe I'm a progressive left of center Democrat. And as a commissioner and as someone who served 8 years, I certainly understand that you have to figure out how you're going to pay for programs, pay for services. But I do consider myself a progressive person, particularly in terms of inclusion and diversity. Dan, I think you noticed when I was a commissioner, I hired a Spanish-speaking person for Village Hall because I believe that it helped meet the needs of Forest Park. As a commissioner, I pushed for involvement in the schools because I thought that's a way that the village could serve the community by improving our schools. And of course, I started the Juneteenth tradition in Forest Park, and I think that was a progressive measure. So I consider myself a progressive person.
Okay. So you mentioned diversity. Forest Park has, I would say, become comfortable with talking about its diversity, but it is not often a real substantive conversation. It's just like, yeah, we're diverse. That's who we are. So what does diversity mean to you in terms of how it ought to be manifesting itself in village life in ways that it isn't yet?
I believe that diversity certainly involves inclusion. It involves bringing people into the discussion and into village life who have not traditionally been a part of the discussion and a part of village life.
And like, who are those people who you think have not really been included up till now?
Persons from racial minority groups. Frankly, I'm an example of that. When I moved to Forest Park in '99, my wife and I rented an apartment. I decided to coach soccer because I wanted to have my son's fees paid for. As a coach, I would not have to pay for him to play soccer. Initially, I think because they did not know me, I was looked at with some skepticism, but I turned out to be a decent coach. And that led to me being invited to join the Traffic and Safety Commission and eventually being asked to run for office. But, as a member of a minority group, as a member of a racial minority, I kind of had to push to be involved. I had to show up to everything. I've told you before, I go to every school event that my kids are in. So I was kind of knocking at the door. But in a lot of ways, our village has not really reached out to people who have not traditionally been a part of this community. I've seen instances where moms who are African American want to volunteer in the schools, but for whatever reason, there's a breakdown in communication and they just don't feel welcomed to volunteer. Now, this was years ago. The schools are doing a lot better at that today, and I'm glad to hear that. The Park District, when we started Juneteenth, it was a very different experience for Forest Park. People were actually saying things like, Rory is not going to allow white people to come to Juneteenth. Now that is absolutely crazy, right? But, there's always resistance to inclusion. But the whole point of the event was to bring people who may feel a little bit marginalized into a space with people who have influence in the government, whether those people are Park District employees or school district board members or village employees and village policy setters. And we were successful in doing that to an extent. And eventually, we got the village to go ahead and establish a diversity commission. So I don't think the question of inclusion or diversity is going to go away anytime soon. I think it's happening organically, but it's been a slow process and it's going to continue.
Beyond racial minorities, are there other people who have been on the outside?
Yes, absolutely. Lesbian and gay, renters. Sometimes you go to the forums and you hear the R word, renters, as if renters are not full participants in Forest Park. Like I said, I rented an apartment for 7 years when I got here. I offered to coach soccer. They didn't say, hey, come on, just be the head coach. But it took a little bit of pushing, but I was persistent. So yes, there's a difference between haves and have-nots. Have-nots maybe feel not 100% welcome in Forest Park. But again, that's the beauty of the Diversity Commission. I think that the people who sit on that board or that commission are inclined to be welcoming, and they're inclined to want to bring people in. I think there's a lot of room for Forest Park to create new traditions, some kind of Hispanic or Latino celebration, something for Mexican Independence Day or Cinco de Mayo. There's Hispanic Heritage Month. We haven't done anything like that. We have to change our mindset to where we no longer only have Merry Christmas on the village decorations. There's room for other ethnic and religious holidays to be highlighted in Forest Park and to make those communities feel like they're a full part of Forest Park.
Chris, diversity, what does it actually look like in practice?
That's a different question. Forest Park is unbelievable diversity on all levels, and when you start talking about diversity in age, color, and there's a very strong pride group in town, as you alluded to as well. And with the Diversity Commission that's a couple years strong now, and is a fantastic leader in Kate Webster. I don't know if anyone knows her. I know she's a little frustrated with where the Diversity Commission's at right now as far as being able to be a reporting entity to the council. And they should be given a little more power to have influence on village policy and be consulted on everything from hiring practices to the chamber should, when we do a festival, you don't have to have just a Latino festival, but if we include on our music fest just some diversity in acts even, I think it's more open to everyone in town. I don't know if anyone else here saw John Rice's film on the first African-American couple that bought a home in town. It's a fascinating, and it's a quick watch. It's about 25 minutes. I was very proud to host a showing of it, and we had a great little diversity discussion afterwards. And it was surprised on people's thoughts. Some people feel, and I think Roy had mentioned before in his time, in his position, that he doesn't feel, he did maybe when he started in soccer, that he's not ostracized in any way, shape, or form, and other people are having a completely different experience. Roy obviously is, in the village alone, coaching soccer, being on the village council, has made a name for himself a bit. But I think, as I alluded to, Dan, the Diversity Commission given a little more support from Village Hall would go a long way in just kind of massaging into the next level of a more inclusive government and village.
So there's equality. Give me a working definition of racial equity.
Well, when we talked a couple weeks ago, we talked about it would be fantastic if when you called the police or the fire department, it reflected the makeup of the community. Now, that's not always easy in hiring practices, and when you talk to the chiefs, they'll tell you that. To me, it's something to strive for. I don't think we've done as much as we could in that area. If you go village wide, I think that's a good starting point. Build from there.
Rory?
I don't know that I have a definition of racial equity, but I believe that our village has a ways to go. But we're working on it. We're working on getting there. The schools now have at least 2 African-American principals. And it's great that young black children can see an African-American person in a leadership role. Phil Stevens has Dr. Brunson, and I forget the principal's name at Grant White. But I met him very recently at a PTO function. The Park District has done a great job of hiring members of racial minorities, not necessarily for leadership positions, but they're kind of coming through the system now. And, you know, at risk of sounding like I'm bragging, I think it's in part because of some of the relationships that were developed, you know, through constant advocacy over the last maybe 8 to 10 years. The village does a poor job of hiring minorities. However, Karen Deluski, the director of the community center, is trying to hire young people who reflect the consumer base in before and after school care. Full disclosure, my daughter worked at the community center after I was a commissioner, okay, not while I was commissioner. But in all seriousness, there's an expression in the community. You cannot be what you cannot see. You know, we've never had an African-American firefighter in Forest Park. I don't believe that's by design. That's just kind of how it's worked out. We have very few police officers on the police force in Forest Park. We have an African-American evidence technician. You know, she works internally in Village Hall, but we're certainly not at racial equity in Forest Park.
So, recently had the chance, along with my colleague Nona Tepper, to interview the police chief and the deputy chief, and it was a very interesting conversation, and a lot of positive things happening within the police department. But one of the questions that I asked was the racial makeup of the department, which is, I think, 28 sworn officers, and that there is 1 African American. They've lost a couple of people to retirements, black people to retirements, and they expressed the challenges of dealing with hiring procedures and testing, that it has been hard to bring in African American officers. This department has some history where they are perceived as not being completely fair in their treatment of African Americans, lawsuits and the like. How can you, as mayor, over time, work to have a more diverse police department, fire department, village hall? What messages do you send? What changes in recruiting do you undertake if this is ever going to be real?
So in terms of the reputation of the police force, earned or unearned, there's always a training component, right? So our police force can be trained to more effectively and maybe even more courteously interact with persons from racial minority groups. I believe that's a good starting point. In terms of recruitment and personnel, we can reach out to minority groups when it's testing time. When I was a commissioner for accounts and finance, at one point Chief Klinke, who is no longer the fire chief, but at that time, he explained to me that part of the requirement to become a Forest Park firefighter is that you have to be a licensed paramedic. And he said very few African Americans get the paramedic training, and so they're not eligible to be firefighters in Forest Park. So what we did is, in advance of a testing round, we encouraged minorities to apply. We took an ad out on the website of an organization called the International Association of Black Firefighters. It increased the level of black applicants for that round of testing. It did not yield any hires. Chief Klinke also reached out to some firefighters that he knew from other departments who were African American. He invited them to test in Forest Park. You know, I believe that's the kind of leadership that a mayor or a commissioner can exert. Again, we're not there to micromanage, but if we find what we consider to be a problem or something that needs to be addressed in terms of hiring, you know, we can make general recommendations. We could also work with our legal counsel to see if there's anything we can do to maybe tweak some of our requirements. I don't want to get too much into the details because I'm not an employment lawyer, and I certainly wouldn't want to create an impression that I want to replace a red employee with a blue employee.
Chris, thoughts on that?
Going back to the police force, it's a culture. It's a culture thing, and we've had a new chief now for coming up on 4 years, and I don't want to speak ill of maybe the previous chief, but it's definitely a different mentality. Our chief before, our chief Aftanis, was very old school, long-time cop. Chief Aftanis is more of an administrator. And I think that changed the culture a little bit. But you, as the mayor, you are in charge of the police force, so ultimately you need to take some responsibility of what's happening within the culture of the police department. You're absolutely right. We, as a village, get sued on a consistent basis far more than any other village of our size. We pay out. We have a reputation of settling, and we get lawsuits, some very warranted, some not. And it's a quick. There's law firms that specialize in it, and there's a big red dot on us as a mark these days. And at some point, you have to fight one of those lawsuits. It's going to cost you more money, but you can't have the reputation of being the town that does wrong and will settle on every lawsuit. I think I answered the question, Dan.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There has been, I think, for some while, some sense of division within Forest Park, and it really reared up over the video gaming. But that is not the beginning or the end of it. Some people have suggested there's division over people who have lived here forever and people who are newer. Is there some underlying division in Forest Park? And if so, as mayor, what do you do about that?
There is. I think everyone in this room will tell you that there is in some way, shape, or form. People that have lived here their whole lives, born here, etc., take pride in that. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in living in Forest Park your whole life. I think some of the people, that get called newbies or whatnot. I've lived here exactly the same length that Rory has. Moved here in '99 myself.
So that's not very long.
No, you're still not a Forest Parker. No, you need to be third generation before you're considered a Forest Parker. I will say this has been an interesting campaign in the sense that when I ran 4 years ago, I was the newbie and the old school people in town who wanted not a lot to do with me. In the 4 years, I think I've stayed pretty active in town. And I think I won some of those people over. And I think if I'm able to do that, that takes some kind of charm, I guess. But it's continuing to talk to people. There's a lot more. You have a lot more in common with people when you have a discussion with them instead of picking one topic on Facebook and yelling at each other. And I think I mentioned this at the last debate. I know people that have known each other 20 plus years that would talk over the fence and ask how their kids are doing. They would be on Facebook yelling at each other like they've never met and they hate each other, and they don't. There's civility's lost, but I think having conversations with people over a period of time, reaching out beyond your little comfort zones and people you think may not like you. Hey, once you have a conversation, you like one thing and you can riff on that. There's, like I said, we have a lot more in common than we think.
So if you're mayor, how are you going to personally use social media?
I'm active on social media now, always have been. The village has an ordinance where village employees are not supposed to post in certain ways. I think the ordinance was passed in 2013. I think it needs to be updated. We need to have an official transmission from Village Hall, a page that we manage, because a village employee will just be floating information out there like, can we trust this information? So we do need an official village communication. And then as mayor, one thing you can say about Mayor Calderon is he's on social media a lot, and he'll answer questions. He'll go into the build site or the town hall site or resident site, and something pops up. Almost comes to a fault, he'll answer whether you like the answer or not. I think you need to be on social media. That's where your residents are. They're asking questions. They expect answers. And if you're doing it from the official capacity, the mayor has, I think he has his personal Facebook page, and he has one that it's called Mayor Calderon, and he's answering on official capacity in that way.
Issues of division?
There is some lingering resentment from the referendum in November, obviously. But when I got ready to run for mayor, and let me back up. When I ran the first time for commissioner, I was considered very new. I'd been in Forest Park for about 8 years, so I was extremely new. But during that time, I spent quality time with longtime Forest Parkers, like the late Howard Bud Boy. He was a longtime Park District leader. And I sat with him in front of the Park District and watched the fireworks. And I volunteered with him at the No Gloves softball tournament. And he and his wife told me a lot about some of the old traditions in Forest Park and how Forest Park was modernizing. And I spent time with other longtime Forest Parkers. And, despite any position I took on the whole video gambling issue, when I got ready to file and run for mayor, I had 20 people circulating my petitions. Some of them were longtime Forest Parkers who I've learned have lived here their whole lives, and some were very new Forest Parkers who were just now getting engaged. But, I said earlier, as mayor, I would be accessible and accountable and very visible. I don't plan to use social media. Maybe there is a role for the village in a social media platform. I tend to think it's an official village website that can be regularly updated with statements coming from the village as opposed to coming from the mayor or the commissioner of X, Y, or Z. I believe it becomes less personal. I think a lot of times with social media, you can't see the writer's affect, so people misinterpret things. And we all know that, Mayor Calderon has sometimes gotten himself in trouble with social media, right? There were the comments that were seen as denigrating the Me Too movement. That's a problem, and that's a part of the reason why I don't spend a lot of time on social media. And, while we're on the topic of social media, it recently came to my attention that someone has claimed that I want to raise vehicle stickers to $250 or $300. That's not the case. You did not hear that from me. But in all seriousness,
go higher than that?
But my point is that social media, it can become very problematic, and I would rather use face-to-face interactions with village residents or communicate through an official Forest Park website. But I think we should remove personalities from it.
So let's talk for a minute about referendums, not video gaming specifically, but one of you is going to be the next mayor. There are going to be elected commissioners. There are going to be tough choices that need to get made. Some will be controversial and so on. To what extent are we saying we are electing a mayor and a council to make those decisions, and if we don't like them, we vote those people out, versus when should something go to a referendum, a binding referendum, outside of what is legally required in terms of tax hikes and so on? Is this all just, up for a vote now, or what?
I think binding referendums in our village are extremely rare, right? I can only remember one. There's been the question of whether Forest Park moves towards home rule. I don't have a strong position on that one way or another, but it has come up as I've talked with people in their living rooms very recently. But yes, the voters elect a council to make decisions. The council should communicate a basis for those decisions. If the council knows that those decisions are going to be controversial, or that there are very strong feelings on each side about those decisions, then it's up to the council, the mayor, and the village to kind of engage the residents in the discussion about what we're doing. People need to feel...
What's an effective way to engage?
There could be a number of ways. There could be, there could be town halls. There could be committees set up to take resident feedback and then advise the council at a later date. Again, the mayor, I've said it several times today, I plan to be accessible and visible. So there's always a chance for face-to-face interaction to where a resident, a voter, can explain his or her concerns or ask the relevant questions, what have you. But I think we both have enough sense to know when an issue is going to be very contentious. And, there has to be a process, and we can arrive at that process. Not simply, in my case, I wouldn't say by myself, but with the advice of legal counsel and other resources in the village. But I'm certainly not running to be, king decision maker. I want people to feel good about the decisions that the council is making.
Well, engaging the citizens, and if anything, this crowd says that people want to be involved. And a lot of that has to do with the discussion getting up to the point of the vote. As you said, Dan, we're electing people to make those decisions, but you can engage the citizens. I think the major problem with how video gaming was rolled out is, and what made me upset was we didn't have those town halls we were promised. We didn't have the feedback from the citizens and the bar community having a discussion together. It never happened. It's all of a sudden somebody caught wind because someone mentioned at a budget meeting that it was being considered, and then the citizen referendum started rolling from there. But if the citizens were allowed to be part of the process there, that's a very big decision for the village. And I was very upset that we didn't have the town halls. I personally threw a town hall on video gaming in 2016. We packed the room. People wanted more information and wanted to have their voice heard. And we were promised a couple by the village, and we had one. And I think they just felt, or I think we all felt, that we were left out of the process a little bit. As far as engaging the public, I've said this before. I think as a mayor, I'm going to have regular office hours where citizens can come in and have discussions with me. I'm going to give a yearly State of the Village address. I think people want to know what's happening within the village. I think it's important to keep the citizens informed. And I think you get feedback from events like that. You're letting people know what's happening in the village and not happening behind closed doors. That was one of the things why I ran for commissioner in the first place, is I felt like things were happening. You'd go to a council meeting and all of a sudden something's on the agenda and you had 48 hours to get a public comment together because you had no idea what was happening. And pulling that curtain back and letting the citizens at least know what's going on, to me, is a huge first step.
How many hours a week are you at Village Hall? Would you be at Village Hall as mayor?
I've never heard a complaint about Mayor Calderon when it comes to him being at Village Hall. And he takes meetings. He fortunately works in his businesses in town. I'm in town a lot. I get to make my own hours as well, owning my own business. And I think you have to be there for the meetings that are happening. I think staff is there for a purpose. But if IDOT wants to meet, I think the mayor should be at a meeting with IDOT. I think there's important things that the mayor has to be there for, but I think the mayor has to be there for the citizens as well. And holding regular office hours and an evening one day a week and maybe in the afternoon one day a week, so that they feel like that their mayor is accessible.
Rory, your thoughts on hours? Do you work downtown? Is that where you're?
I work downtown, yes. Most days I take the Blue Line downtown. In terms of hours at Village Hall, I'll be there as many hours as I need to be. I'll also be mayor, whether I'm at the soccer field or attending functions in the schools where people can easily approach me. I'll be mayor when I'm traveling to Springfield to advocate for Forest Park. I'll be mayor if I go to Washington, D.C. to advocate for Forest Park. Dan, I don't know how many office hours it's required to be the mayor. Like I said, I'm not running to micromanage. I don't need to sit in on all the meetings, with the village engineers to discuss planning. If a vendor needs to meet with me, it can be done in Village Hall, it can be done downtown, it can be done telephonically, but I will be an active mayor, and I will leverage all my relationships for the benefit of Forest Park.
So you are actively running with a slate of candidates, none of whom have been elected previously. So there's a lot of energy and new blood But what's the downside of potentially having a village council that has no veteran members on it?
I don't know what the downside is. I'd certainly be there with experience. I plan to share my experience with the council. I plan to strongly suggest that they spend quality time with the department heads, learning about the assets that Forest Park has, our physical assets. I'm talking about things like hazmat equipment, all the equipment that we have. You know, they should see the water station. They should see the public works garage. They should know what all the employees do, because as board members, you know, they have responsibility for the actions of our employees. They should be informed. I will also encourage them to take training the way I described with the Institute for Government and Public Affairs. You know, there are 2 women running on my slate. If they are elected, I will try and get them, or I will get them nominated for I Will. I Will is what's called the Institute for Women in Leadership. It's an organization put together by Loretta Durbin, the wife of Senator Dick Durbin, and it brings together women elected or appointed officials for relationship building, networking, and educational purposes. What I want to see is an effective council. They may start with sort of a knowledge gap, but all of these people, you know, they have their own strengths and attributes. John Kubrick is a business person, a highly sophisticated business person. Jessica and Mark were very engaged in the village. Julianne's a social worker. She's here all the time. You know, I'm not here to promote the slate. I'm here to obviously explain my candidacy. But these are all dedicated people who want to make Forest Park a better place.
Chris, you are running as an independent. Are you aligned with any commissioner candidates directly?
Officially aligned with anybody? No.
Unofficially aligned?
I mean, I like Marty Tulalien a lot. I consider him a political mentor. When I was elected, I was an independent. Rory came up with Mayor Calderon. Then he wasn't with Mayor Calderon. He ended with Mayor Calderon. I'm not sure where he's at with Mayor Calderon right now. But my experience was a little different as far as coming in as a minority commissioner. I wasn't warmly welcomed, let's put it, and Marty Tulalien was a guy that I met with for dinner on a consistent basis to learn. He was a great asset, so he's a person that I hold in very high regard, very bright man. So the other people running, though, the energy that Ryan Russ has is incredible. Dan's great with budgets, Dan Novak. I don't know a person in the world that doesn't love Joe Burns. And Ryan Nero, I know a little bit, not that well. But seems like a bright guy as well. And quite honestly, the people on the slate aren't bad people. I've known John Cooper quite a while. He's a smart guy. I don't know Mark, Jessica, I know Julianne and her husband Andy a little bit, but it's not like they're bad people. I think they're all good people. Whoever gets elected, I think are going to do a good job.
So you were quoted in the review as saying that you don't want the support of Mark Hosty and Tom Mannix.
Yeah.
Okay. And yet there is a sense that they are in fact supporting you. Is that right?
Well, I can't stop who's supporting me.
Well, do you think they are actively supporting you and/or Mayor Calderon?
Well, if you think you're the best candidate, you'd want everyone to support you. But I'm not seeking their help in any way, shape, or form. That's for sure. I had a discussion with Commissioner Mannix, myself, and Marty Tulalien after a council meeting for maybe 3 minutes that had to do with the new townhouse project on Burkhardt Court. Nothing to do with the election there. I mean, I served with Commissioner Mannix for 4 years. I know him a little bit differently than most people's public perception of him, which I think we could all say isn't great in this town. But I'll have a conversation with him, but he's not actively part of my campaign, I guess is the best way to put it. I met with, I thought I was going to meet with Lori Kokanis and Dorothy Gillen when I met with the chamber, and Lori couldn't make it, so Mark Hosty showed up in her place. So I had a meeting with Mark Hosty about the chamber, nothing about the election other than explaining the chamber and where I thought the chamber fit within the village.
We are running out of time. Specifically, top 3 sources of money for your campaign?
Outside of myself, there is a engineering firm. There is my father. And I'd have to look at the third.
Who's James Pirelli and how is he tied to your campaign or not?
Jim Pirelli, I met in 2015. He was helping a commissioner candidate that was running. He asked if I meet with him, and I met with him. He was the mayor of Maywood at one point. Helping me? No. I have conversations.
Actively not involved in this campaign.
He's reached out to me. I think he might be helping a commissioner candidate or two.
Okay, Rory, where is your money coming from?
Lots of small donors. I have received one $1,000 donation from a local resident. I received a $500 donation from another local resident. I received a $500 donation from an engineering company.
Same engineering company?
Delphin.
So can you tell us who the local residents are?
I received a $1,000 donation from Dorothea Seneschal. I received a $500 donation from a friend of mine, an attorney named Jerry Bramwell. He lives in Forest Park. And like I said, a $500 donation from a company called Infrastructure Engineering Incorporated. It's a minority-owned engineering firm.
Should we be expecting a blizzard of campaign mailers in the next 3-4 weeks? And will any of them be like really horrible?
Stay tuned. Not for me.
There'll be mailers. I hope nothing negative. I have made a personal vow not to speak negative of my opponent. I'll point out our differences. I hope those are never construed as negative, but I'm trying to not even say something that might be construed as negative. I wanted to be positive, talk about what I'm going to do, and that's all my mailers have been, and I've received 2 more at least. We'll say the same thing.
What do you admire about Rory?
I think he's a good father. I mean, if you have kids that are going to Notre Dame and Ignatius, you must be doing something right. Monique has something to do with that, I'm sure. But
in the reverse, what do you admire about Chris?
I admire Chris's activism. I think he cares about the village. He's taken a leadership role with Kiwanis. He takes that very seriously. And he fights for what he believes in. He's a strong communicator. I know he's knocked on a lot of doors. He obviously cares about Forest Park.
In the next, let's say 2 years, just to put a time frame on it, is there going to be a resolution of some sort with the Altenheim? There will be a decision made to...
In 2 years, I believe the buildings will either be down.
The old buildings.
The old buildings will have a funding mechanism to bring them down. That will be one of my top priorities as mayor. Whether or not there's an absolute resolution on what to do, I think we should be 90% of the way there. You know, I see us bringing together a group of stakeholders, certainly proponents of the park, CTA, the village, the chamber, trying to figure out what's the best use of that property. We have to really assess what can be done, what kind of revenues can be generated through different kinds of development.
So you think that's an active process of trying to engage those people?
It'll be a long process, not super long, but it certainly won't be done in 6 months.
And some portion of the Altenheim property will be sold off in some way in your mind?
I don't know the answer to that question, Dan. It could be. It might make sense to go back to the current Altenheim board and see whether we can update, the terms of the sale contract. That was arrived at in 2001. There's a fairly new board. One member of the board is a Forest Park resident. Another member of the board has strong ties to Forest Park. Again, that would be one of the early steps, is to go back to the Altenheim board and see if they'd be willing to revisit some of the terms of the agreement.
Chris, Altenheim, 2 years?
no, there was a council meeting about a month ago where a host of residents from the Grove showed up because there was talk of doing a town hall on the cultural park. And a town hall is the early steps, and some people thought that we're going to be breaking ground there in a matter of months. That's not the case. A plan in place, absolutely. There's a proposed huge capital bill in Springfield right now. Our state rep happens to be in a leadership role on that. I already put together, their session ends at the end of May, so a new mayor is kind of behind the 8 ball. So I already submitted my request for Forest Park for the Capitol bill to our senator and our representative, and the first thing on the list is money to bring those buildings down. If the village didn't own those buildings, if a private person owned those buildings, we'd be fining them every day. They're not safe. There's people that are squatting in them. I've taken a tour of them, and they need to come down. So that's A1, has to happen pretty soon. And then it's a discussion with the community as far as what's going to happen there. But yes, I think a portion sold off. I prefer the front space for hotel use, as I talked about, and the back space remaining green space for residents to enjoy.
How do you use the library?
Laura, did you ask this question? You know, when I first got to town, I used it more. I don't know if that's a good thing, but because it had a lot of resources that now we readily have available at home. But the library is important to any town, from the youth programs that they have after school, availability of computers for people that don't have access, the Wi-Fi hotspots that are available. I mean, it's invaluable to a community.
Right.
My 9-year-old son uses it. I used it to study for the bar exam. I couldn't always get a privacy room, but I'm glad that the library is going to be renovating to service the residents. I was really happy when the library set up the teen room several years ago. It was needed. It's still needed. I believe the village should be there to support the library. You know, Laura is talking about her concerns for safety and better use of the library. So it's really not about how I use it, but it's about whether the library is there to serve the needs of this community.
So what haven't we talked about that is very important to you?
So one thing, we were talking earlier about diversity and inclusion and about the village and its workforce. I said earlier that the police and fire have their own testing procedures. One thing I did not mention is that I was able to make a recommendation to Mayor Calderon that we at least appoint an African-American lawyer to the Police and Fire Commission. And he did that, and I think it's a good thing because it at least had a different perspective on the board, that kind of governs disciplinary issues for police and fire. And so as mayor, I will look to make appointments that reflect the community. There are really talented residents who would like to participate. I know this is not something I'm speculating on. As mayor, I will also involve commissioners in the appointment process, at least interviewing residents for roles on the advisory boards and commissions. But I think we've had a great discussion here today. I think we've covered, most of the important topics. And like I said, I have great relationships that I think distinguish me from my opponent. I'm ready to lead as mayor. I won't need any kind of training. There won't be a learning curve. I've taken the meetings that the mayor takes. I have great relationships with our county commissioner, our state senator. I've talked to her about Forest Park and its needs. I know our state rep. I've talked to Congressman Davis. So I'm here to advocate for Forest Park and to bring resources to Forest Park.
And Chris, what haven't we talked about that you want to bring up?
Well, I don't know if we have the time. First of all, very thorough questions, Dan. Great job, but I don't know if we want to start a conversation on parking right now, because it would go a while. But I think it needs to be addressed at some point. There needs to be a better plan in place. I have a few ideas. I've been bouncing around with a couple people of a little more accessibility for residents, whether it be trying to find more space for lots without using eminent domain, and or some kind of forgiveness plan. That one time you forget to call your car in, and $50 later, where that can be rolled into, if you pay it, you get like 5 additional call-ins for that month. So there's some way to get some value out of that $50 that you don't want to pay the village because you forgot one night. It's a long conversation, but I think the conversation needs to be had. I see someone from our parking department here, and she knows very well that there's some residents that aren't happy when things like that happen. It's a discussion we need to have and definitely explore some options.
Thank you to both of our candidates. And thanks to the Forest Park Public Library for hosting us today.